Hello all. The following video is for the purposes of revision, with the aim of presenting a brief recap of the poem, some analysis, some of the questions raised by the poem, and potential links with other poems in the anthology. As always, nothing in this video will be more important than your own reflections on the poem. To the recap. In this two-stanza poem, Sujata Bhatt looks at the complex relationship between history, language, culture, and identity. The poem is steeped in the language of religion, nature, and oppression, with the two stanzas offering contrasting visions, the first of freedom and respect, the second of rigidity and violence. The images range from Greek and Hindu gods, snakes, monkeys, trees, and books, to the final metaphor envisaging language as a murderous imperial weapon. Yet while Bhatt offers a powerful critique on one hand, there is also a sense of wonder and ambivalence on the other. Analysis. To begin with, then, the title. The authority of history is immediately called into question. The subjectivity of history is implied, as though historical accounts represent only the success of one story over another. The first line immediately offers an image of cultural splendor, with a declaration that great Pan is not dead. Pan is the ancient Greek god of nature, with his appearance half man, half goat. As a figure of dual identity, Pan is perfect to represent the idea that identity itself is the product of different cultural and linguistic roots, or rather different histories. But Pan has moved away from his birthplace, and next the language moves from the extravagant exclamation of the first line to the casual simplicity of the second and third. He simply emigrated to India. In terms of register, it is as if we've moved from religious epiphany to a geography textbook, or from oratory to conversation. The abrupt change in register reflects a kind of playful movement that begins to take shape in the first stanza. The word emigrated evokes the idea of different peoples and cultures having emigrated across both land and time. The word perhaps hints at the idea of escape from the forces which do not allow one to move freely. This freedom of movement is illustrated through the poetic form of the first stanza, so clearly contrasted with the second. Like the gods they describe, each line may roam freely. Yet there is also the suggestion that such freedom is not absolute. Like emigrated earlier, that they should be disguised perhaps suggests a desire to be hidden, as though their liberty were still under threat. Indeed, even in the idea of the gods being able to roam freely, if we listen carefully, there is in that word roam the subtle, ironic echo of an imperial past, still reverberating through time and space. Next, we are told that every tree is sacred, and it is a sin to be rude to a book. Here, trees are worthy of religious devotion, and books are objects of great delicacy and significance. The repetition of "it is a sin" throughout the remaining lines offers a touch of gravity, with the word sin igniting visions of moral law. To shove, to slam, and to toss one carelessly are all images of indifference and even disrespect. And the poetic form, with the sudden line indentations, seems to reflect that indifference to tradition, as though the poetry now moves just as carelessly as the actions it describes. But with the entrance of the longest line in the poem, the tone changes to one of quiet authority and meditation. There is a delicacy in the image of turning a page, and the word gently contrasts sharply with the preceding images, which seem comparatively violent. Sarasvati is the Hindu god of literature and the arts, whose serenity must not be disturbed by the barbaric indifference of the sins mentioned earlier. Here, given that a book dominates so much of the first stanza, finally being linked to a god, we should perhaps take a moment to reflect on their significance. Books may be considered symbols of knowledge, wisdom, culture, and tradition. They are the keepers of history and the repositories of language. In them, we may find our history, and perhaps, therefore, ourselves. The personification of the tree conveys the idea that a book is not simply a lifeless, inanimate collection of pages. It is not one object among many, but a link in the chain that runs across millennia, linking past and present, man and nature, humanity and the gods. Here they are objects worthy of devotion, and as the final lines of the stanza make clear, they are of course related to the trees from whose wood they were made, just as we are shaped by the histories from which we came. And yet books are filled with that powerful, beautiful, dangerous, diverse, and endlessly fascinating concept, language. Which brings us to the second stanza, with language now the protagonist. The opening 4 lines offer 2 rhetorical questions with brutal implications, and yet a touch of ambiguity at the same time. First, language is directly associated with oppression. Whether it be wars between nations or arguments between individuals, language is a weapon with which wars are waged. In the next question, Bhatt is even more explicit with the mention of murder. Language is seen as a violent, murderous force, but here it is not physical murder that is envisaged, but the metaphorical mutilation of identity. Yet at the same time, the words which language truly meant to murder someone also point to the seeming innocence of language, as if such brutality is often not truly intended. Language seems to be both the innocent messenger and the guilty party. This ambiguity runs throughout the remainder of the poem. It is also worth mentioning that the opening lines of the second stanza offer the first and only evidence of a partial rhyme scheme, with a temporary A-B-A-B structure. In contrast with the free verse of the preceding lines, this sudden, more traditional poetic structure perhaps suggests that there is a timeless element to these ideas, that language is, has been, and always will be a source of tremendous conflict and controversy. As the rhyme conveys, every tongue belongs to someone, and there is therefore the instrument of oppression within all of us. But here the poet moves away from stern critique, if indeed that was ever truly present. As the stanza continues, we seem to be met with another question in how does it happen? The tone emanating from that word, how, appears to be one of uncertainty, confusion, or mystery. The word torture adds a sadistic element to the violence of the previous lines, and next we have an abstract image and extended metaphor suggesting that language can attack and distort the very core of our being. With its curved shape and capacity to injure, the long scythe is compared to the tongue coming from the conqueror's face, and the result is that the soul has been cropped. Here in the second stanza, there are no gods, only violence. Words are the foot soldiers in the colonizing army of the conqueror, and it is not land or gold at stake, but the souls of men. The contrast in the 2 stanzas may serve to convey the idea that it is our attitude to language that defines us. If seen as something worthy of reverence and devotion, then language can give us links to our history, culture, and even the gods. But used only as a weapon, language becomes a violent source of destruction, and men the victims in a godless world. Seen through this lens, poetry itself, with its emphasis on the importance of language, might function as a liberating force amidst a world of would-be conquerors. These lines involving the scythe, perhaps the most evocative in the poem, lend themselves to a variety of interpretations, which combine to convey the author's own ambivalence with regard to language. A scythe, through images of the grim reaper, is often associated with death, which reinforces the vision of murder mentioned earlier. Yet a scythe, as an agricultural tool, is also necessary for the preservation and regeneration of crops, enabling them ultimately to grow again, like the unborn grandchildren mentioned in the final lines. Perhaps then, without the continued confrontation of words and languages, then whole cultures, like crops left untended, might wither and die. We might then consider identity, culture, and even history as existing in a continual process of regeneration born of conflict. However painful a process it might be, Sujata Bhatt seems to suggest that it is inevitable, and yet, as the final two lines reveal, it is not something only to be lamented, for it will yield the young and the loved in the shape of the unborn grandchildren. With those words, the author is looking to the future, imagining a time when her grandchildren will grow up speaking a different language to the Gujarati that she herself has grown up speaking. In a way, then, those grandchildren will themselves have the different history of the title, and there is perhaps a sense of estrangement and even sadness in those final two lines, as the image of grandmother and grandchild, speakers of different native languages, are separated by an ocean of linguistic and therefore cultural difference. Yet if there is sadness, there is also perhaps acceptance, for what seemingly began as a question with, "How does it happen?" now ends as a statement, with no question mark to be seen. It is as though the author has recognized the inevitability of the process, that languages change and evolve, and that the young cannot help but love the language they know. Some questions to consider. What is the relationship between language and identity? How big a part does language play in shaping an individual, a culture, and a history? Is language a medium to be revered, or a weapon to be feared? And is history ruled not by the events that shape it, but by the words that recall it? Some links to other poems. With its focus on identity, A Different History shares a thematic interest with both Continuum and Summer Farm. All three poems partly investigate the complexity of what constitutes identity. How is it formed and where is it to be found? In looking at history and the changes that take place over time, we might also consider the planners, which sees a kind of necessary destruction of the past for the creation of the future, and horses, which, like A Different History, laments what is lost with the passing of time. Finally, with its mention of Pan and Sarasvati, poems such as Pied Beauty, Horses, Continuum, and Composed upon Westminster Bridge can be usefully compared, all of which, in their way, explore the relationship between mankind and the divine. That's all for now. If you have found the video useful, then please do subscribe for more poetry revision with Mr Brooker.